Good afternoon. Everybody complete their game of 5 in a row, right? Anyone beat it yet? Really? I'm not. Anyone beat all 24 levels of zero gravity? No? It's one of our apps, so. Thank you, Friday, last session of the conference. Thank you very much for being here. A lot more people interested in localization than I thought, but that's good to see. So this is a design. My name is Tim Hewer. I'm one of the program managers on the Windows XAML team. Been working with the Silverlight team for the past 4 years and recently part of the Windows XAML effort. So these are designed to be chalk talks, and when planning the conference, we had tried to help educate everybody on what a chalk talk was, and they said, oh, no, you'll have a whiteboard and just like constant Q&A and things like that, and clearly this is set up differently. So I hope that you have questions. I have some information that I would like to share with you and kind of maybe set the stage a little bit, but I plan for less of a presentation and more of a conversation. So what I'd like to do is just go ahead and kind of introduce the changes that we've done for XAML and localization to kind of set the stage. Did anyone go to Kip Knox's session right before this that talked about the broader view of the Windows resource management? A few people. Okay. So I can set the stage a little bit broader then, perhaps. And Chris, you'll just have to keep playing zero gravity or something, right? I assume you're all here to you have interest in making sure that you have apps that are world ready. Available to the store brings opportunities for you to distribute your applications worldwide. And obviously, the more languages and locales that you can adapt to, the better you're going to have sales and be able to reach a broader audience. So, what I'd just like to talk about is these kind of 4 things. What's different for XAML? Talk about the history of kind of some of the methods for XAML localization. What we currently have in the preview bits for Visual Studio for tools and how we're enabling some of that assistance. What are the different approaches using the APIs that Windows provides versus what we're doing specifically allowing you to do in markup in XAML? And then element versus layout approaches for XAML. So at any time, if you have questions, please feel free to interrupt me. The only thing that I'd ask is that you come to the microphone so that we can make sure that everyone hears it and it's recorded for the session as well. If you don't and you can't run to the microphone fast, I'll repeat the question anyway. So, who has completed a application localized in XAML, either in Silverlight or WPF? Who is a fan of BAML? Few people. Okay, so these are kind of the 3 different types of localization that have existed for XAML applications. The first one is WPF. What we do is there's a mechanism in WPF where you actually provide your resources and localizations for your XAML using the BAML technologies. And this has arguably been quite painful for developers. It's kind of a sore spot. Not an easy process, not a terribly intuitive process. For .NET developers, the second 2 is kind of what is probably most familiar and most common is the usage of resx, or the resx file format, which Visual Studio has historically provided a nice editor for you to put resources of strings and different types, objects, icons, images, and it's basically resx is an XML schema. However, what .NET has done for you is always created a strongly typed representation of those resources in that file. And so if I add a resource to my resx file called foo, and let's say the file is called resources and I have a name value called foo, I would have a strongly typed representation where I can set a string to resources.foo. So in Silverlight, usually what a lot of people have done is combine that with a data binding approach where you've kind of wrapped the resource manager around your own class, set it as a static resource in your user control or in your app or something like that, and used a lot of value converters or other things to kind of extract the resources out. In WPF, some people have done that as well using custom markup extensions. Silverlight 5 introduces custom markup extensions as well. I anticipate people will still do that. So that's kind of some of the histories and different ways people have done that. All of them are, kind of cobbling together different technologies, one on top of the other. So the thing is, those three mechanisms get challenging if you don't think about localization from the beginning, especially the WPF one. So the idea is that make sure that you have this new opportunity with Windows Metro style apps and a distribution mechanism in the store that will be available to non-English speaking folks as well. So if you make sure that you organize your content, prepare ahead of time for localization, we hope that what we've designed in both the API and the XAML localization will allow you to quickly, maybe you put your English version up very quickly while you're working on localizing your actual resources, and then you can just include those resources and re-upload your package without changing your XAML, without changing much of your code. So that's our goal with what we've designed here. But the goal hinges on you being prepared and thinking in advance of localizing your content. So here's one of the things that is a difference between those methods is in Windows 8, we have this introduction of a new file. And if you've been playing with the bits, maybe you've seen this, maybe you haven't. It's called a resw file. You can imagine that the difference between X and W is the only difference. We have and it actually is built on top of the resx schema. It is the resx schema. I shouldn't say it's built on top. It is the resx schema. You may kind of wonder, well, why didn't we just use resx? Resx has a very specific meaning to .NET developers, and especially the resx gen tool that actually does that strongly typed convention. So the file extension is different. The underlying structure is not. The editor will be familiar to you if you have used resx before. The only difference is that Windows resw files only allow currently string-based content. So you'll notice that the editor restricts to string-based content. The other two things is that you have, and actually that is available for native and managed, and actually everything I'm talking about is not specific to C# or VB, also available for C++. So this concept of this resw file and this editor are new to C++. There's no more RC files for Metro style apps. And so the other thing is a kind of a convention-based approach. So you see in this little screenshot here how I have two folders, DE, and ENUS, so those representing BCP 47 tags. This is the most common, I think, use of BCP 47 tags, but there's other ways you can do it if you're not familiar with the tag format. There's other ways you can do it. This is kind of the most common. And you can organize your resources in a structure from the beginning. So you can see in this screenshot I have a resources file. So the resw, you can think of that's going to be my string resources. But I can also localize other resources, right? So I can have an XML data file and like a text file, any really file-based asset or path-based asset. Images is probably the most common secondary format there. And so what the underlying system does is there's a resource manager in Windows 8 that for path-based implementations, your application doesn't really have to worry about itself picking the right language and looking at current culture UI and those type of things. Windows 8 allows what's called a language list preference. So I don't have to say my language is English or my language is German. I can say I have a preference. I speak both. My preference is German first, but I also want to make sure that English is there as well. So I can set up a language list preference. The user is in control of that. It could be n number of languages. And what we do in path-based resources is, let's say you have an image element and you say, my image is in the folder images/logo. And when the runtime decides to go and get those bits to render in the visual tree, it is aware of all the complete context that it has. It's aware of screen resolution. It's aware of pixel density. It's aware of the language list that the user provides, all of these things. And it basically looks into its dictionary And if you were at my previous talk, I kind of referred to this concept as it's like a DNS for resources. I have said I want logo PNG, and I've asked the resource manager, and the resource manager says, I hear your request, I have other information about that request, and I'm going to tell you the actual resource that you're going to get based on heuristics of scoring mechanism. So in the simple language case, if my language list was German-English, and I have provided a resource for German, and I've requested logo PNG, the resource manager knows my language list and would say, oh, I have an image for German. I'm going to give you that one because that's the user's preference, and would provide that. But I, in using path-based resources, don't have to say, I don't have to do a string format that's, images / current culture UI / logo PNG. I just give it the logical representation. This is a folder-based convention. There also is a file-based convention, and I say this for the native project system. Is anyone a C++ developer in the room? A few people. So the typical Visual Studio C++ project system, the default experience is usually filters over folders in the view in the solution navigator. And so that can kind of trip some people up when they think they're creating folders. In reality, they're creating just virtual representations of content, and it's not a true folder, and so that's not picked up by the resource manager. So instead of a folder-based approach, I could have, we'll use the logo as an example here, I could have actually said, I could have kept everything in the root of my project and said logo.en-us.png or logo.dede.png. So I have a folder-based convention I can use, which I think from an organizational standpoint, I think probably will be simpler for people to manage. Or I have a file name convention that I can use. And both of those apply. So from an API difference, for .NET developers, the resw file no longer generates strongly typed information. Okay, that's probably the biggest difference. You don't have a typed class of your resources, right? So resw is now basically a text file, a design time representation of your resource only. The second thing is that there's the resources that you have, those images, that resw file, are no longer embedded in assemblies. So they're actually marking something as a resource is not valuable to you, and for this purpose, is not valuable to you in the Metro style world. For .native developers, I already mentioned that RC files are not supported in this world right here. I see a question. Yes, sir.
Going back to the previous slide, does that imply that logo.png has to be a unique name? You can't have the same file name existing in different folders for different purposes?
That's correct. Depending on the path that you represent it at. So, and actually this screenshot, now that I look at it, is actually incorrect. The default images is, the default logo PNG is images / logo PNG. The localized resource actually would be under DEDE, there should be a folder called images, and that folder underneath that. So, but it does imply that, yes, you can't have, it's kind of a unique path reference. So what's new for both developers is a new API, the Windows Runtime API for resource management from an API level to extract string and path-based resources using an API. And then we'll talk about what's new for XAML developers. So here's an example of the resource loader. This is the most basic and simple example of when you're assuming all the default context that Windows is going to provide. I new up a resource loader, and I say get string and the key name. Simple as that. The C++ below is the new projection language, C++, so it's very, very similar. And that's how I would retrieve a string. So no longer a strongly typed representation. I don't have my resources.welcome text. I'm actually going to have to pull that out of the resource manager. For XAML, we have the option of using markup support now. And so markup support in XAML means that you can have an element, and this doesn't only have to apply to text. And by adding a UID element to, or UID attribute to your element, you're basically saying, I'm possibly going to have this value, this element localized. So I'm setting it up in advance. This is a part of that, setting your project up in advance. You don't have to have an element. You don't have to have values for that element if you set it in XUID. So I'm just basically saying I'm preparing for localization on this element. So I set a UID attribute, and then the XAML is going to do some work for me, and we'll talk about that in a second. And this mechanism is the same for, because this is a markup level mechanism, it's the same for native versus managed. Now there are some advanced situations where your name value collection in the resw file is going to have some specific syntax, depending on deeply nested user controls, some attached properties and things like that that are not going to be as straightforward in the markup method, but will still work. So this is the simplest example here. On the top is my resw file. The editor should look familiar. It is the resx editor with just the support for strings only. And I have a name value pair there called mytextblocks.text, and the value is the phrase, "this is some English text." My XAML has a text block that has an XUID value called myTextBlock. And if I were to run this, what happens is that the parser, the XAML parser and the runtime say, I have a UID, it's called myTextBlock. I'm going to do a resource lookup and see if I have any values that need to be replaced. Okay, and it sees one, it says I have a value that needs to be replaced, it's the text property, and I'll replace that value. Question? Does the feature support dynamic language switching while the application is running? Haven't really tested it that deeply yet. You're talking about if I change the language preference list while the app is still not terminated. Yeah. We don't reload the resource context currently in the XAML platform, so it probably will not replace to the new language dynamically. But I know that's something that we have looked at because we have similar things for the DPI notifications and things like that. However, actually, you can listen for that context change in your application and force a change and reset the context yourself, too.
Excuse me?
Oh, yes?
If I want to reuse the same text, for instance,
yes,
multiple times, but for different properties of controls, I will have no way of specifying the value once, do I?
That's correct. So this method would be for specific element localization. So you can actually just do a straight-up name value collection. So let's say I wanted this to be hello text, and I'm going to use it in various different, or OK button text is probably a better example, right? So, and I want to use it in various different places. I can do that. I would just set the name value to OK button text, and I would set the value, and I'd put it in different places. However, since it's not attached to any UID property, then I'm relying on using the API mechanism to extract that string out and use it other places. Okay. We have thought about ways of being able to say, I have a value called OK button text, and maybe I have, in using this example here, I would have myTextBlock.text, and the value would be some markup language that refers to that other resource. We haven't gotten to that point yet of understanding the feasibility of that, but that's something that we would be thinking about. The other option is, let's say you want full layout localization, right? So right to left languages, that type of thing. So other than string localization, I want an actual different view for my XAML. The same mechanism allows you to do the same thing. So how we had logo PNG in the German folder, if I wanted main page to have a completely different view, I would put a mainpage.xaml in that German folder. And so our runtime, when we're doing our load component on the XAML and we're loading the XAML for you, we are always going through this resource manager. So in fact, when you look at if you were to look at the generated code, and we can do that in a second, you'll see that the URI that we construct to pull the resource out. And that's instructions to the resource manager saying, I need this path, here's some context, give me the correct path. And so if I'm German and it finds main page in German, it's going to load that one. So I can do full layout localization this way as well. Now, the last bullet here is the kicker and the caveat. You have to make sure, if you're using that simple route, that your elements are going to be the same. So if I am using a code behind model approach and I have a button and it has a click event handler, you won't basically the German main page won't have code generation behind it, right? It's just a content page. The class will already have been generated for you. So it just becomes a replacement of that markup. So if you change anything fundamentally that the class is expecting, then you'll have issues. So let's take a look at this example here. So I've got a simple application, and I will add my English folder, my German folder, and I will add a new item. We have an item template for you here, resources. One other convention is that the resources file to be automatically included in this process must be named resources. That's only a requirement for automatic loading of your resources. I could have something called timhuer.resw, but now my application is responsible for loading those resources. So during app load, I would have to say, and also load this resource set named Tim Huer. But by naming it resources, you'll get it automatically loaded for you. So let's say welcome text, hello world. And let's make a copy of that for German. And so now I've got my resources. In my markup, I'm just going to say, I'll just put my name. So if I were to render this right now, it would render the text Tim Huer. I'm not giving any further instructions here. But we'll keep that text in there. And we'll add UID. We'll call this element welcome text. And so now if I run the application, because I've declared resources and I have English resources available, it shows me hello world. So it has replaced that particular value that I've asked it to replace. Now if I stop and change my language preference, so this is the language list selector in Windows, so I can say, actually German is my first language preference. Do nothing to my XAML, and I'll get the string replacement for me. So this is the most simplest form of element localization. Now you might be saying, well, okay, if these are design time resources, like what is happening behind the scenes? And so what we do is during build, we generate this file called resources.pri. This is a binary file. There's an SDK tool called makePRI. PRI is a package resource index. And you can see by default, this is the resources.pri is the default file we loaded. If I would have created timhuer.resw, I'd have a timhuer.pri. But I would be responsible for loading that. And what's in this file is the resource mapping of the strings and paths and the conditions that it sees that have been met. So this is a binary file. The same tool that is actually used to create this file, you can dump it to an XML format and see the structure and how it's scoring mechanisms to saying, oh, this is a higher score for this match on this path or something like that. But that's the, so you'll never see resw files in your package or your app. You just see the binary representation of that. Question?
Yes. How does it work if some resource is missing in one of the files? Where does it look for it? If hello Welt was missing?
So a resource name was missing?
Yes.
So if it doesn't find it, it's just going to continue along and see what the next match is for that. And
yeah, but if the next match is in the Chinese resource file and I don't know Chinese, where does it look for it?
So if it cannot find it anywhere in its resource path, and it can't determine a default score for matching. So if your only language is Chinese, and we ran this application right now, the text you would see would be whatever the XAML that's rendered.
Okay.
So what we do in the parser is we basically say, I have an XUID. I'm going to go look up information. Do I have anything based on the context? And it'll say, I've got German, I've got English, I don't have Chinese. I'm not going to do anything, and I will let the parse continue.
Mhm. Is there any mechanism of synchronizing the REST-W files?
There is currently not a mechanism of synchronizing in the tools for the files that you have XUID and across all the different ResW files. It's a gap that we're well aware of. There's actually a few Codeplex projects that do this. We think that those could easily be adapted to support this mechanism as well. There's also a German company called nDevelop that creates products for doing this specific thing for XAML and ResX files. And they've, after this week, they've already reached out to us and said, help us understand this a little bit more. So Visual Studio is not providing a synchronization mechanism currently, but there's ways to do that. So.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Another question, yes? So the question is about fallbacks. Awesome segue. That's the next slide here. Yes, so one of the things that you saw the mechanism that I use to actually test the language. You can actually change your own display language and easily test that. From an API standpoint, you could also kind of do an if debug, and the same resource loader API provides something called a resource context. So I can create a new resource context and say my locale is FRFR or my resolution is this. I can kind of program this context. So from a unit testing perspective, if you wanted to make sure that things were happening, you could do that. The other thing is about a fallback language. So a fallback language is, and actually how it is represented in the tools is currently called a default language. I just want to make sure it's clear that it actually is not a default language. It is a fallback language. So that's something that we're considering changing to make sure it's understood. But it is an actual fallback language. So what the fallback language means is, let's say I develop my application for English, and I say the fallback language is English. I provide German and French resources, and the user is Chinese. In their language list, the only language is Chinese. So the resources they would get would be English resources, because that's what I've determined to be the ultimate fallback. The resource loader will say, I've got all these resources. I can't find anything matching the context that the user has provided me, and so I'm going to use the fallback resources, which are defined as X, and you define what X is. By default, we define the ultimate fallback language based on the OS, or the installed Visual Studio language that you have. There is a mechanism to change it. It's in the project file. I can switch back and show that. So in the current preview bits, you would have to edit the project file manually. And this would be the property. This is the default language. So yes, go ahead. Right. Correct. Yep. I'm wrong, yes. So just to repeat the question is, I may have an OS language-specific setting that, to use the example here, is that my OS is set for Italian, and I have all the Italian date formats and things like that. That's my kind of regional culture settings, and that actually will be represented in the typical .NET current UI culture settings. However, as a user, I may prefer English as how I want to see things. So the way that we do this in Windows and in the resource context that's provided is based on your user preferences, not necessarily your OS settings. So from a language perspective, my OS could be German settings, and I can create my language list to be French, Chinese, Spanish. And the language list is what is used to provide the context, not the OS current culture. Did that answer your question? Yeah. So if I were to change this value right here to FRFR, then my fallback language would become French. And that's simple property. We don't anticipate people changing this often in their package. It's kind of a one-time choice, which is why there's not a project property setting on this. In C++ and the JavaScript project system, there actually is a UI to change this. There's reasons for that. They have a different way of showing properties than the managed project system, which is easier to set up. We currently didn't feel it was a frequent thing that people would change. So you do have to edit your proj file if you want to change that value. There's a question over here. The question was, does the language list impact the numeric and datetime format? I am not the total appropriate person to answer that question, but I don't believe it does, because once I set the, actually, oops, changed the wrong one. I think I still have German set, and my regional settings are still exactly how I specified. I'm not the definitive source on that one, though, but I think the language list is just a preference. Again, it's different than what you set as your regional settings. And we use the language list for locale-specific things. Is there any other? Okay. So if I wanted to let me show you the resources PRI. Oops. And let's see. So I got my resources PRI. In the tool that creates this is called make PRI, and the tool that you can dump the value is called make PRI as well. So I just say make PRI dump, or instead, not the slash, and it's going to dump the binary format into an XML file that's easier for me to read. So if we can kind of see how the resource manager interprets things, we can see that it found a couple qualifiers. So it found a qualifier German, it found a qualifier English. And then it creates, currently in here, it creates two resource maps. One that is files and one that is resource. Files you can think of as any path-based resource. Resources is what is going to be the contents of those resw files. So as we look at the files resource here, you can see that this is what's going to be requested, app.xaml, or more specifically, this files is just kind of a qualifier, so the actual thing that would be requested would be app.xaml, and we're saying how that maps here. And again, these are fairly simple here. As we go to the resources, we can say, here's the, it found some text resources, and it says, hey, I've got, when someone looks for welcome text / text, now we in the parser, we translate this to a dot notation, so you don't have to do anything there. But when it sees welcome text text, it's going to look and it sees that I have two qualifiers. If the context that was provided to the runtime in the parser matches one of these qualifiers, in which it would, right? So language ENUS and language DEDE, this is the value that it returns for that. So this is kind of the mechanism of how the resource manager sees things. I see someone standing for a question. Yes, sir.
Would we be able to use binding on that list?
On binding to the API?
XAML binding.
What would you bind to? Sorry, I'm trying to follow.
Well, see, the problem we have is that we have to do localization based on the user and based on the settings for the machine, because we have multiple users looking at different screens coming from the same app.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we want a particular form to be bound based on the user setting, and sometimes we want the other way.
So you want to bind. So the question is can I use binding based on the values that are in the resource maps?
Based on either binding to the VM layer and pulling out what languages are available for that particular. See, we have a bunch of languages we support.
Yes.
And then in a particular install, we only will support a handful of those languages, and we want to be able to select those based on the form and who's looking at it.
Okay.
So we can't use thread setting because that different forms are still being shown by the same thread.
Yeah. So you could, you absolutely have the API available to you that gives you all the information about the resource map that was built. So you can look into that and say what's available and kind of start querying on that type of stuff. In the instance that you're describing, you won't be able to use the XUID approach for the element localization. So you'd be dropping back down into using the API level for the resource manager at that point.
All right, thanks.
Yep. So I mentioned that when we build the application, what the URI gets built at. So let me show the generated file here, and let's bring up main page. And if you haven't ever seen the generated code file for any XAML language, this is very common for WPF and Silverlight. We generate some goop for you. It's a technical term. And the primary method is how your page actually gets instanced and loaded is what we call load component. And if you were to do this in WPF, you would see this load component refers to a pack URI, which is completely obtuse to understand. In Silverlight, it also has a mechanism. Actually, the Silverlight code generated file looks like a relative URI. Under the hoods, it follows a similar flow. But here you can see that we have this new URI that starts with MS resource. Now, if you remember back to the resource map, we had this notion of files, all right? So this is how we're generating that. We know that path-based information is under that files resource map. And so what you see here is ms-resource. So URIs in WinRT are always absolute. They can't be relative, which is why you see a full URI here. And ms-resource is a protocol that directly communicates to the resource manager. So I can ask the resource manager and give it an absolute URI, and it will give me the actual value represented back. And in this case, what you're seeing here is I've asked the resource manager to say, hey, look in your resource map called sample app, right, which was the name of my application. So it's saying, look in your resource map, in the sample app resource map, tell me if you know anything about a file called main page XAML. And so what actually will get loaded is the correct file. In our case, we didn't localize main page XAML, so it would just return the default. If we had a German version and my language list was German, the URI would look exactly the same. The result it would get back would be different. Question? Yes? So there's two things that you can do in XAML. This is an example of, this isn't a localization, but it follows along the same thing. You can see that I have this one image that actually just uses a relative image. If you have a relative image in your project, you should continue to do this. So we automatically understand how to communicate with the resource manager from declarative to the resource manager. So in declarative XAML, you can use relative URIs. Anytime you drop into code to actually try to pull a path out, or in this case, in this example here, where I would try to set a bitmap image, and I need to do the source, I have to provide an absolute URI for that. And we've in my tips and tricks, I talked about this concept of a base URI. And so that will help you build the full MS resource URI in order to pass that path. So if you tried in code to say, hey, I want a bitmap image and the URI source is /images/foo PNG, it would fail. In fact, it would fail first because it's not an absolute URI. Did that answer your question? Okay. Question?
When you are doing your default loading, as far as languages are concerned, does it have to match exactly? Meaning if you have Australian English, does it load the English one rather than giving up, or how does it do it for each of the variations?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It is, so the resource map that gets built is based on the information that it gets aware. So there is a kind of a heuristic engine of how it builds up these resource maps. But you notice that I had EN-US. I could have had EN, right, and then go deeper. But the resource manager will always provide the best context it can. So if my language list was Australian English, then that is what it's going to default look for. And if it can't explicitly find that, then it will fall back to whatever the fallback language is found.
But so what I'm getting at, so you set up, let's say, your default language as German here. Would it be smart enough to even load the English US if that's all you had, like you have now?
If my language...
So let's say, yeah, so by your fallback that you set up in your project was French.
Yes.
Was German. And then you had just the English US in your project here with the German. Would it be smart enough to go and load the English US rather,
So
even though you're
I
Australian?
think what you're getting at is
if you don't have the EN folder, will it be smart enough to load the EN US?
No.
Okay.
So you have to, yes, I mean, if you're only providing localized, the rule of thumb is you need to always provide resources for your fallback language. In that way, you'll suffice in that scenario. Another question.
Yeah, I have another question. Currently, for our desktop.NET applications, we are using so-called binary localization. This actually means we have a tool that extracts resources from compiled assemblies and then uses a translation database to create a satellite DLS with the correct language. So for this scenario, this would probably mean to open up the PRI file and translate it and pack it back up, or
Actually, what you would do is you would provide the resw file.
yeah, okay, this is one.
Oh,
way.
I see what you're saying. So your translator service starts at a binary format, is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah.
Okay.
And we create the binary satellite DLS.
Yeah,
And .NET words.
I understand now. So what you produce here, the end result that you get in any Metro style application is a package, right? An AppX package, which is basically an OPC zip file that you can open up, and this resources PRI file would be in there. If that needs to be a part of your flow, yeah, you're going to need some SDK tools to crack open that PRI and start going through it.
But it's possible after we modify it, it's possible to pack it back.
It's not possible because the block map for the package will be different at that point. So that's why I said you're gonna want to get at the design of the resw files so that when the PRI gets generated, well, it is possible. You have to regenerate the PRI and you'd have to regenerate some package information as well, because the signature of the package will have changed, right? You've added different information.
So the preferred way is actually to do source localization.
The source localization, yeah. Okay. And so what we've tried to do in designing it this way is that you can have an application, and so in our application here, if we wanted to add French, our apps out in the marketplace, we want to now go add French. I can send my resw file to a French localizer. I get it back, maybe some images or other assets. I create the French folder. I put those assets in. I repackage and upload my application. That's the ideal situation. I realize that's the simplistic situation as well. I mean, there's other complex areas of when you have user controls, but fundamentally, that's where we're trying to get to, is not a true lang pack where you actually just install a lang pack, but you kind of drop the lang pack in your source, repackage the application, and redistribute it. Because the store will, if I'm an English user, if I'm a French user, I don't just get the French application, right? I get an application and the resources that it has available to me. Another question? No, so the question is, do we support kind of sub fallbacks or different? You define a fallback BCP 47 tag. So one singular one. We don't do the concept that you're describing. Yes, questions? They will. That's an excellent question. So I'll repeat the question is, let's say I have a different class library, or I've taken a dependency on a third party, in fact, right? That will have its own localized resources as well. Yes, so as a class library, if we were to create a class library right here, and in that class library I've decided to provide resources. And then I add a reference to that class library. If the demo gremlins are with me. Oops, not that file. Anyone can read binary? Somehow my notepad is killed. I'll try to bring it up. But yes, the resource files are merged, and you would have a different resource map. So each PRI file is based off of what's called a PRI index, or that resource map name. So we should have two resource maps. So you can see that now I have the sample app resource map, and I have the class library resource map. So they were automatically merged at that time. Yes, another question? Is there a way in here to determine what my fallback language is? In the PRI or through the API or both? In the map. Yeah, if you're from the resource, from the PRI file itself, I think there is, and I'm trying to figure out why it's not showing in that dump. It could be an issue with the dump, but yes, it's stored in kind of an initial metadata header section of that. But from an API perspective as well, like if you're debugging, you have available to the context. So if you're debugging, and you're like, hey, my German stuff's not showing, you can inspect what the context is being provided and saying, oh, the context is this, and that's why I'm not getting it. And also kind of query from the resource sets that are loaded, what the fallback is set as. Question? Yes, another question.
In Windows 8, how the user switch the language setting?
How the user switches the language setting in Windows 8 is, I already have two languages installed here, so that's why I get this message. But if you do a search for change language preference, you would get this menu here.
Like a Windows 7. In Windows 7, you have a control panel and
you still have. So there's difference. There's language list preferences, and then there's regional settings. The way that you set your regional settings for you as a user is very similar way in Windows 7. Mm-hmm. How I set my preferences of how I want apps to behave in my language list and locale selection is this.
In Windows 7, you have a default language or something, like in case Unicode is not supported, then you go back down to some language, this kind of setting. In the last page, last tag of the control panel.
Maybe I'm not following you, but there's two things that you can set: regional settings.
No. That's okay. That's okay. This is another question.
Okay.
In Windows 7, language setting control panel, language, display language, and you have a control panel in Windows 7. And the last page of the control panel, you have a language setting which fall back in case the application doesn't support Unicode.
So, okay. I am not the expert on Windows language settings, so I'm going to defer that question to Kip Knox is who you want to talk to. I'm not sure if he covered it in his.
I want to understand if it's a fallback language you explained is something related to that setting.
The fallback language that you're setting in your project is just information you're providing to the resource loader. It has nothing to do with what language you specifically are setting or not. I could have 0 languages installed on my machine and compile an application that says my fallback language is German. And I'm just providing that for my package so that the package is aware of what language it supports and what language it needs to identify as the fallback language. That's different than me as an end user setting my language preferences and my language list. Those two are mutually exclusive.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Another question?
I've got this Windows Phone 7 application that was localized, and it contains a lot of binding in the views. I was hoping to be able to migrate it to Metro, but seeing this, how am I going to change it? Because there's a lot of work involved.
So you're using the binding approach to resx?
Yes.
The strongly typed.
I'm binding to the view model that contains a reference to resources.
Right. Yes, you're going to have to, if you want to completely migrate the exact same XAML, you're going to have to change the mechanism that you have. Resx is just not supported in Metro style applications.
Any chance that that Windows Phone will move this way?
Not on the phone team. I can't speak to that. I don't know. I know Peter is here at the conference, but I don't know if he's here in this room. And,
I'm here and we can't say.
Peter Torres says he's here and he can't say.
Okay, so I guess it's a yes.
Are there any other questions? A few minutes left? Yes. So the question is, how is the language how is any of this reflected in current culture UI? So current culture UI will still get to like your OS level specific settings. It doesn't affect. It's more of like your regional settings and things like that. Just like this gentleman was mentioning here, like I prefer Italy, and those are what my settings are, and that's what current culture UI would see. And in fact, in WinRT, you'll see that a lot of the .NET kind of current culture UI was moved to the Windows globalization namespace. So instead of actually looking for current culture UI, I don't know if it's physically named the same thing, but you'll want to look at the Windows globalization namespace for that type of stuff. Is there any other questions? Yes, sir. Yes. So the question is, if I have a bunch of languages and I have a lot of them, can I pull them off to another project? Yes, you can put them up into so can I put them into a folder deeper in the root? The only thing to keep in mind here is how you reference these. So and in fact, you could actually have put you could have a folder that's called resources and use the file name convention approach instead of the folder-based approach. So I can say resources and say resources.enus.resw and have them kind of all segmented off it that way. Yes, question?
Is there any provision for in-text value substitution?
Is there any provision for in-text value substitution?
Inline with a single text string.
Inline, so like a rich text scenario?
Yeah.
Using these methods, no. If you were using like the rich text box, there's text APIs where you can get certain information. There's APIs on those where you can get certain information about the run and where certain things are, and then you could kind of use the APIs of getString based on those values.
One thing about the approach with using binding in XAML to like a resx, like a static resource, is if I have the same string that I use in 50 different views or whatever, I can have one string resource, but this looks like I have to do it for every single named element. So like what happens if I have an OK button in 50 dialogues? Or
Yep,
50
so
pages?
I'm not sure if you heard that question that we brought up that that's a gap that we're aware of. You can actually still use that data binding approach, right? So currently in that approach that you're using, you're wrapping a value converter or a class that talks to the resource APIs, you can still do that, right? So you have the resource loader APIs, and I can still do that. What we would like to get to is something like this, where let's say I have, OK button text, OK, and I don't know, something like this. Where we have some internal mapping where I can define it once and other places can refer back to that specific key name. We're not there yet. It's good feedback. We know that that's an area that needs work. Any other questions? At the mic.
So can you use formatted strings in ResW files?
Can I use commented strings?
Formatted strings.
Formatted
With formats
strings.
inside? Yeah. And parameters?
Like string format and things like that?
Yeah, I mean to replace some content inside a sentence. Yeah.
So, no. Yeah, you'd have to feed it into a string format. So what you have here is going to be completely replaced, is how it works.
Okay.
So if I wanted to change like the button width, I would say, or the text box or the font size, I would say welcome text.font size and provide a double value. I can't provide any type of code execute. Nothing executes in that. It's a replacement, not an execution. Saw a question right here. No more question? Okay. There are currently not custom markup extensions supported in the Metro Style XAML platform.
Question here.
Yeah, so you could use the APIs at that point. All right, so I can use resource loader and say, get string, you would get your string, and then you could use formatters on top of that. But you would be doing it in code, not the markup replacement mechanism.
Can we replace welcome text.text with welcome text.font size?
Yep, that's what I just mentioned. Show it. So it's 72 in here. Actually, I think my language list is wrong, so change it. So you can set values there. Some of the nuances are more in the attached property space. So let's say a better question would be, how can I set the tooltip property? And so the syntax is not as straightforward because the tooltip lives in a different namespace than your actual application. So there's going to be some different annotation that you have. And we haven't landed on the full annotation of what that's going to be just yet. Any other questions? Yes? Everything exactly that I've shown you works. The tool, like the attached properties, you'll have issues. Some of it will work, but you'll have issues. Yeah. But all the other API mechanisms and things like that, the folder convention, the file convention, all that works. Design time support, excellent question, yes. There is no design time support for real-time parsing of those values and replacement. So what we advise is that you still, obviously your designers are going to want to know text widths and things like that. So at your markup, you should provide some design time mechanisms. Again, an area that we're fully aware of that needs work. Not sure if we'll land there for this release in Blend tools or not. But yes, if I just assumed all replacements and just had text block, XUID, and text block, it won't even show on the design surface, right? Yeah. Any other questions? So there's 1 minute left. Yes, sir. Good question. Is there any plan to bring back a strongly typed code file or class generation for managed code? That is an excellent question for the CLR team. I know that I would like it. I know that they would like it as well. There's some constraints that that they have to live in because of WinRT and things like that. And but they're definitely thinking about it. No definitive plans right now. If you had, another thing I should point out is if you had a class library that had resx files, and let's say it was a portable class library that had resx files, and I just did the add reference trick to my project that I did here, they do automatically translate the resx files to resw for you. You just lose the strongly typed class file of that. But there is some mechanism, at least for converting them, because it is resx under the hood from a schema standpoint. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate. Hope you had a good conference this week, and travel safely home. I appreciate you attending the last session block of the conference. Thank you.